You're a janitor. You mop floors. Sit down before you embarrass yourself. Adrian Cross said it loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough to make sure it stung. And Evelyn Carter? She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just picked up her wrench, looked that man dead in the eye, and said the 7 words that stopped a room full of hardened bikers cold. Give me 5 minutes, then write the check. If this story moves you, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Everything changed. Started the way most mornings did in the garage of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club of Redwood Falls, Montana, with the smell of motor oil, coffee, pumpers, and old leather. Nobody paid attention to the woman pushing the mop across the concrete floor near the back of the building. Nobody ever did. Evelyn Carter had been working that same floor for 3 years. 3 years of showing up before anyone else arrived, unlocking the side door with the key Cole Harrison had given her without ceremony, without a speech, just a quiet nod and a "we trust you, Ev," cleaning grease off benches, sweeping cigarette ash from corners, restocking towel pools in the bathroom that the guys never bothered to replace themselves. 3 years of being invisible. That was fine with her. Invisible was safe. Invisible was peaceful. Invisible meant nobody asked questions she didn't feel like answering anymore. She was 48 years old. Her blonde hair had started going silver at the temples. She didn't bother with the dye anymore. Hadn't since David passed. Hands were rough in a way that had nothing to do with cleaning supplies. They were the hands of someone who had worked with them her whole life. Someone who understood what hands were actually for. Nobody in that garage ever looked at her hands. They looked through her. She preferred it that way. The trouble started on a Tuesday. Cole Harrison, president of the Hells Angels, a man built like a refrigerator and twice as solid, walked into the garage at 7:14 in the morning with his jaw set so tight Evelyn could see the muscles working beneath his beard. She'd learned to read the room in this place. She'd learned all of them, actually. Cole's tight jaw meant something serious. Not biker serious, not bar fight serious. Something that went deeper than that. Behind him came Danny Ruiz, the club's road captain, and Big Ray, mechanic, a man who could rebuild a carburetor in his sleep and had done so, allegedly, at least once. His face was pale. That alone told Evelyn everything she needed to know before a single word was spoken. When Big Ray looked pale, the problem was real. Cole walked straight past her without a word, not out of rudeness, just distraction, the way people walk past furniture when something is burning, and stopped in front of the bay where the truck sat. Evelyn paused her mopping and looked at it without looking like she was looking. She was good at that. It was a V12 Custom, a monster of a machine that the club had been building and refining for 22 years. It wasn't just transportation. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was the Hells Angels in mechanical form, loud, unapologetic, built from scratch by men who knew what they were doing and didn't need anyone's approval. Every part had a story. The engine block had been sourced from a salvage yard in Nevada during a road trip that became club legend. The custom intake manifold had been fabricated by a member who'd since passed, a man named Tommy Briggs, who everyone still talked about, the way you talk about someone who deserved more time than they got. The truck was supposed to lead the charity ride on Saturday. The annual run to the Children's Hospital in Billings, 200 miles, motorcycles, and this truck carrying supplies, raising money, showing up for kids who needed to know the world wasn't as hard as it sometimes seemed. It wouldn't start Ray. Cole's voice was flat, controlled. That was how Cole sounded when he was holding something very heavy, very carefully. Tell me again. Ray shook his head. I've been over it 3 times, Cole. Questions there. Fuel pumps working. I checked the timing chain. I checked the injectors. I pulled the spark plugs. They're fine. I hooked up the diagnostic unit and it's giving me clean readings across the board. She won't fire. Won't even try. What does that mean? It means I don't know what's wrong with it. Ray said those words like they cost him something. A man like Big Ray, admitting he didn't know something mechanical was the equivalent of a confession. I've never seen anything like this. The computer says nothing's wrong. The engine says something very much is wrong, and I don't know how to close that gap. Danny Ruiz, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, exhaled through his nose. About the ride. Saturday's 4 days away. I know when Saturday is, Cole said quietly. Silence that followed was the kind that fills up with everything nobody wants to say out loud. Evelyn started mopping again, slow, steady circles. She heard Cole make the phone call from across the garage. He didn't close the door or lower his voice. Cole Harrison was not a man who had learned the habit of hiding difficulty. He said what was true and let it land where it landed. Adrian, yeah, it's Cole Harrison. A pause. The truck's down. I need an extension on the payment. Just 2 weeks the ride will cover most of it. And after that, another pause, longer this time. Oh, I understand, but just. And then Cole went very quiet, the kind of quiet that means the person on the other end is talking in a way that doesn't leave room for anything else. And he hung up. He stood still for a long moment. Then he turned to Danny. Get everyone in here. Tonight. We need to talk. Evelyn found out about Adrian Cross the same way she found out about most things in that garage, by being in the room when people forgot she was there. Adrian Cross was 29 years old. He had inherited a real estate development company from his father and had spent the last 4 years expanding it aggressively through Redwood Falls and the surrounding county, buying land, renting property, building the kind of commercial developments that made the town look busier without actually making it feel more alive. He had a reputation for targeting businesses that were struggling, offering solutions that turned out to be traps, and walking away from those traps with everything he'd come for. The Hells Angels had borrowed money against the clubhouse property 18 months ago when a legal dispute with a neighboring property owner had drained them dry. The loan had come through a financial company that nobody had looked at closely enough. 2 months ago, Evelyn overheard Cole and Danny arguing about paperwork in the back office, something about ownership clauses and terms that nobody had read carefully when they signed. The financial company was connected to Adrian Cross. That evening, 12 members sat around the long table in the back room. Evelyn continued working in the garage, within earshot if she wanted to be. She wasn't eavesdropping, she was just present. There was a difference, even if nobody would have seen it that way. Cole explained the situation with the directness she'd always respected in him. $60,000. The charity ride was their biggest fundraising event of the year and had been scheduled to cover the bulk of the debt. Without the truck, the centerpiece, the symbol, the thing people came from 3 counties away to see the ride would still happen. Now it would be different. Nations would be different. And that gap would be the difference between keeping the clubhouse and losing it. How long to source another vehicle? Someone asked. Isn't time, Danny said. And nothing we could get would be what that truck is to this event. People don't just come to give money. They come because of what we stand for. That truck is part of that. So we fix it. Ray can't fix it. He's the best we've got. Silence. Then we bring in someone who can. Cole nodded slowly. I already made some calls. There's a shop in Billings. They said they can send someone tomorrow, but it's going to cost us. Everything costs us right now. Big Ray said, and for the first time that evening, there was something that might have been dark humor in the room. But there, Evelyn wrung out her mop and moved quietly toward the storage room. The man from Billings arrived Wednesday morning in a company van with the logo of a shop Evelyn knew by reputation. His name was Marcus Webb, and he was in his mid-40s. Competent, he was. Professional, the kind of mechanic who charged what he was worth and usually was. He spent 2 hours on the truck with a laptop running 3 separate diagnostic programs, a set of equipment that probably cost more than most people's cars, and a thoroughness that Evelyn respected from a distance. At the end of 2 hours, Webb sat on a stool, his laptop closed, his expression careful. I can tell you what it's not, he said to Cole. It's not the fuel system. It's not ignition. It's not compression. Everything reads clean. Whatever's wrong with this engine is something my equipment can't see. He paused. I've only seen that once before in my career. And in that case, the engine was gone. Cole said nothing. I'm sorry, Marcus said, and he meant it. I wish I could give you something more useful. He didn't charge them for the visit. That was how you knew it was bad. Adrian Cross arrived on Thursday morning in a black SUV with 2 men who were not quite assistants and not quite security, somewhere in between, in suits that were designed to communicate money without quite communicating warmth. He walked into the garage the way men like him always walk into spaces they intend to own. Not casual, with the specific, deliberate pace of someone who has already decided how this ends and is simply arriving to confirm it. He was younger than Evelyn expected. Sharp jaw, expensive haircut, the kind of clean hands that had never once been inside an engine. He looked around the garage, the way some people look at property, calculating dimensions, not meaning. Cole met him near the front, Adrian Cole, a smile that was technically friendly. "How are we looking?" "You know how we're looking." Honestly was. "That's why you're here." Adrian tilted his head slightly, as though that was a fair point and he was willing to concede it. "Heard about your truck situation." Tough break. He didn't sound like he thought it was a tough break. He sounded like a man who had expected exactly this. "I want to be fair with you, Cole. I genuinely do. This has been," he paused as though searching for the right word, "unfortunate timing for everyone. And you want. I want to offer you a resolution." Adrian turned and looked at the truck in the bay. Final shot, fair and square. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, setting it on the workbench between them. $60,000 against the deed to this property. Cole stared at the envelope. "If your truck runs by Saturday morning," Adrian said, "the debt is cleared. You keep the clubhouse, you do your ride, everyone's happy, walk away." Another smile. "But if it doesn't run, I take the deed and I'm done with this. And if we just don't take your bet, then the original terms stand, and you're still 60,000 short with no truck and no ride. I'm giving you a chance to get ahead of this." He looked at the envelope. "I'm being generous, Cole. I don't have to be." Cole Harrison looked at that envelope for a long time. Behind him, across the garage, Evelyn Carter had stopped mopping. Adrian had arrived with something else besides the envelope. He'd arrived with 4 men automotive engineers, he explained, from a consulting firm he retained for exactly this kind of technical assessment. They were young, educated, and they carried equipment that made Marcus Webb's setup look like a toolbox from a garage sale. Fiber optic inspection cameras, electronic pressure gauges, horrible diagnostic system that one of the engineers explained could interface with any engine management system built after 1990. To ensure fairness, Adrian said smoothly, "I've brought an independent technical team. They'll assess the truck first, establish a baseline of what we're working with. That way, if anyone claims they've fixed it, we have objective verification." Cole looked at him. "You're very prepared for someone who just heard about our truck yesterday." Adrian didn't miss a beat. "I'm always prepared, Cole. It's how I stay in business." The engineers spent 40 minutes on the truck. They were thorough. They were professional. They communicated with each other in the quick, shorthand language of people who had trained together and trusted their instruments. At the end of it, the lead engineer, a serious young man named Peterson, with a tablet and expression like someone delivering a diagnosis, turned to Cole. "Mr. Harrison, this engine presents a genuinely unusual failure pattern. The diagnostic results are largely clean, which is actually part of the problem. The system isn't registering the failure correctly, which suggests the failure exists in a place the sensors don't adequately cover." He paused. "Our assessment is that this engine is not repairable under current conditions without a complete teardown, which would take weeks. We cannot identify the specific fault with the tools available." Adrian nodded as though this was exactly what he'd expected, because it was. Cole turned away. One of the younger bikers, a kid named Marco, who couldn't have been more than 23, was standing near the back wall, watching the engineers. He caught Evelyn's eye by accident, the way people sometimes make eye contact with furniture and then look away quickly before looking back, because something about the furniture was unexpected. He looked back. Evelyn had her arms crossed. She was watching Peterson and his tablet with an expression Marco couldn't quite read. Not baffled, not defeated. Something closer to someone watching a chess game and waiting for the other player to finish making the obvious mistake. Marco opened his mouth to say something, but Cole spoke first. His voice was quiet. "Fine, Adrian. We'll take your bet." Raj was silent for a moment. Then Adrian smiled, really smiled this time, something that reached his eyes and picked up the envelope. "I'll draw up the paperwork." And Evelyn Carter uncrossed her arms and walked back to the storage room to refill her mop bucket. Thursday wasn't Saturday, and she had a lot to think about. That night, after everyone had gone and the garage was empty, Evelyn sat on an overturned crate in front of the truck. She didn't touch it. Not yet. She just looked at it the way she used to look at engines back when looking was still allowed to lead somewhere. She studied the lines of it, the way the bay lights caught the valve covers, the slight irregularity in the way one of the intake runners sat almost unnoticeable, almost nothing. She heard Tommy Briggs' voice in her head, the way she sometimes heard voices of people she'd never met but whose work she understood. Had fabricated that intake himself. He'd have known its tolerances, the way a parent knows the particular sound of their own child, crying not generically, specifically, personally. She thought about Peterson's assessment. The failure exists in a place the sensors don't adequately cover. She turned that sentence over and looked at it from different angles. He was right. He just didn't know what to do with being right. Evelyn pulled a small notebook from her jacket pocket, the same kind of composition notebook she'd been carrying since she was 22, and began writing. Fixing yet, just thinking on paper. Mapping the logic of the machine, looking backward from what the symptoms were telling her, and forward from what she knew about V12 systems of this generation, this configuration, this particular kind of history. She wrote for 2 hours in the empty garage. When she left, she locked the side door behind her, walked to her truck, a '98 Silverado with 190,000 miles and a rebuilt transmission she'd done herself in the parking lot of the last town she'd lived in, and drove home. She didn't sleep much. She rarely did anymore. But that night, instead of lying in the dark the way she usually did, with the quiet pressing in like something physical, she lay there thinking about the problem, the logic, feeling the shape of it, and somewhere around 3 a, in the specific stillness that comes just before the world starts waking up, she felt it click into place. All of it, not yet, but enough. Enough to know that Peterson was wrong about one thing. The engine wasn't unrepairable. It just needed someone who trusted their hands more than their screen. Friday morning, Evelyn arrived at the garage at 6 a. She swept the floor. She restocked the paper towels. She cleaned the coffee machine that everyone used and nobody ever cleaned. She did all of it the same way she always had: steady, quiet, invisible. The bikers came in one by one through the morning. Cole looked like he hadn't slept. Danny was on his phone. Big Russ near the truck with a coffee, and the posture of a man who had accepted something he didn't want to accept. Nobody talked about the bet much. They'd all talked about it last night. Now it was just sitting there among them, like furniture too heavy to move, too present to ignore. Adrian Cross arrived at 10. His engineers came with him. They set up a workstation near the rear of the garage with their equipment official. Staged, the technical theater of inevitability. Adrian himself leaned against a workbench with a coffee he'd brought from somewhere and spoke on his phone in a low voice with the casual confidence of a man who had already made other plans for Saturday afternoon. The young biker found himself gravitating toward the back corner where Evelyn was running a dry mop over the concrete she'd already cleaned. He didn't know why. Something about her stillness, maybe. The way she wasn't looking at Adrian Cross or the engineers or the truck with the desperation everyone else in the room was radiating. "Doesn't it bother you?" he said quietly. Evelyn looked at him. "What's that? All of this, these guys coming in. If they lose the clubhouse," he shook his head, "you'd lose your job." "I know, and you're just mopping." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been mopping all morning, Marco. It's already clean." She glanced at the truck. "I'm thinking." He didn't know what to do with that. He started to walk away, then stopped. "Do you know anything about engines?" She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite place. "Marco," she said. Marco nodded slowly and walked away. It happened at 11:17. Adrian had gathered the bikers and his engineers near the truck for what he clearly intended to be a final formal declaration. Peterson pulled up his findings on the tablet. The other engineers stood in a row. It had the staging of a verdict. "Gentlemen," Adrian began, "I want to be very clear about what's been established. We've had 2 independent mechanical assessments of this vehicle, one by a certified shop and one by my technical team, have reached the same conclusion. This engine cannot be repaired within your time frame without a full teardown, which is not possible," and he checked his watch, less than 18 hours. He looked at Cole. "I think we both know what that means." Cole stood with his hands in his jacket pockets. His jaw was tight. He was holding something heavy, carefully. "Unless," Adrian said, and there was something in his voice that was almost playful. "Anyone else has a suggestion?" It was a rhetorical question. It was designed to be rhetorical. It was the kind of question you ask when you're certain no answer is coming. Came from the back of the garage. I do. The room turned. Evelyn Carter set her mop against the wall, wiped her hands on her work pants, and walked forward. Adrian Cross looked at her. Then he looked at Cole. Then he looked back at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not concern, not yet. Something closer to amusement. The janitor? He said it lightly, like a joke he was sharing with the room. Is Evelyn? Marco said from somewhere to his left. And Adrian glanced at him briefly, before returning his attention to Evelyn, with the expression of a man who was willing to let this play out for the entertainment value. Okay, he said. What's your suggestion? Evelyn stopped 4 feet from the workbench, where Peterson's tablet sat with its clean diagnostic readings. She looked at the readout for a moment. Then she looked at the truck. I know what's wrong with it, she said. The room was very quiet. Cleared his throat. Ma'am, our equipment. Your equipment is looking for where the signal breaks. Evelyn said, not unkindly, just precisely. But that's not where the problem is. She looked at Cole. I need 30 minutes and your toolbox. The real one, not the one you show people. Cole Harrison stared at her, let out a short, quiet laugh. Cole, come on. You're not seriously considering? How long have you worked here? Cole said to Evelyn, careful, not dismissive, careful, 3 years. And before that, a pause. A long time doing something else, she said. It was a non-answer. Cole knew it was a non-answer. But there was something in the way Evelyn stood, something, in the specific quality of her stillness. She'd looked at Peterson's diagnostic readout, not with confusion, but with a kind of quiet disagreement that made him hold the question open instead of closing it. You'd need to do this in front of Adrian's engineers, Cole said. They'd have to verify it. That's fine. And if you're wrong, if I'm wrong, you're in the same position you're in right now. You haven't lost anything you don't already stand to lose. Adrian made a sound that was close to a laugh. This is Cole, this is your plan? The cleaning lady? Her name, Marco said, louder this time, is Evelyn. Shifted. Something subtle, a collective weight redistribution, the way a crowd shifts when it's deciding which way to go. Big Ray, who had been sitting in his chair with the posture of a man who'd given up, sat forward slightly. He looked at Cole. Cole looked at Evelyn. Show me your hands, Cole said quietly. Evelyn held them out. Cole looked at them for a long moment. The calluses, the specific toughness of someone who'd worked with tools, not cleaning supplies. He'd seen Evelyn's hands 100 times and never looked at them. He looked at them now. He nodded once. Get the toolbox, he said to Danny. Real one. Adrian Cross straightened. The amusement was still there, but it had company now. Listen careful. Fine, he said. Let's see it. If your janitor can fix what my engineers can't. He spread his hands. Write the check myself. Evelyn walked to the truck, and the room held its breath. Peterson leaned toward his colleague and said, in a voice low enough that he thought only his colleague could hear, this is a waste of everyone's. Evelyn's voice, without turning, the third runner on the right intake manifold. You saw the pressure reading was 0.3% low and marked it normal. It's not normal. Peterson stopped. Evelyn placed her hands on the engine. For the first time in 3 years, the woman who cleaned the floors of the Hells Angels garage stopped being invisible. Took one step forward. Just one. The kind of step that was supposed to communicate authority without quite crossing into confrontation. He said again, and this time the word had a little more weight behind it. Scanning equipment covers every measurable parameter of this engine system. A pressure differential of 0.3% on a single intake runner is within normal operational variance. The software flags anything outside of. The software was calibrated for stock configurations, Evelyn said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look at him. Hands were moving along the intake manifold the way a blind person reads, not searching, tracing, like she already knew where everything was and was just confirming. This engine isn't stock. Tommy Briggs built this intake by hand. The tolerances are tighter than OEM spec. 0.3% low on a runner this size. With these fuel demands, at cold start, that's not variance. Friction. Peterson opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. How do you know who built the intake manifold? Because I've been cleaning this garage for 3 years, and I listened when people talked about Tommy. She finally looked at Peterson. Do you listen when people talk? The silence that followed was the specific uncomfortable kind that happens when someone is undeniably publicly correct, Big Ray made a sound in the back of his throat, not quite a laugh. Something shorter and more involuntary than that. He pressed his fist against his mouth and looked at the floor. Adrian Cross shifted his weight. "This is fascinating," he said. Fascinating was doing a lot of work carrying skepticism, impatience, thin thread of something that might have been unease, all wrapped in a single word delivered with a pleasant smile. "A theory about intake tolerances doesn't fix an engine. Cole, I respect the sentiment. She hasn't started yet," Cole said. "Final." Adrian looked at him. Then he looked at his watch. Then he looked at Evelyn and gestured with one hand, a magnanimous theatrical gesture, the kind you make when you're certain the person you're gesturing at is about to fail, and you want witnesses to see how gracious you were about it. "By all means," he said. Evelyn turned back to the engine. Danny had brought the toolbox, the real one, the old snap-on chest that lived against the back wall, and that Big Ray treated with the same reverence most people reserve for things that belong in museums. The kind of toolbox that had everything, organized with the specific logic of someone who had needed everything and needed it fast and couldn't afford to search. Danny set it beside her and stepped back. Evelyn opened the top drawer without looking at it. Hand went directly to a flex head ratchet and a specific socket without any hesitation, the way someone reaches for a light switch in their own home in the dark. Ko noticed. He was standing off to the side, trying to stay out of the way, but unwilling to move further back. He watched her hand go into that drawer and come back with exactly what she needed, and something turned over in his chest that he didn't have a word for yet. She had used that toolbox before, or she had used one exactly like it so many times that the layout lived in her hands. Neither of those things made sense for a janitor. Both of them made perfect sense for something else. She started at the intake, not tearing into it, listening to it. She pressed her fingers against the base of the third runner with a specific, deliberate pressure, moved them an inch left, turning to held still. Then she reached into the toolbox for a thin feeler gauge, the kind used for clearance measurements so precise they're measured in thousandths of an inch, and slid it along the runner's inner edge. Touch so light, it barely looked like contact. The feeler gauge stopped, not caught, stopped. The difference was subtle, and it was everything. "There," she said quietly, to no one in particular.
"There what?"
Danny said. "There's your first problem." She didn't look up. Debris restriction. Something worked its way into the system probably during the last rebuild, and it's been moving. Every time the engine ran, it shifted, got lodged tighter. She tapped the runner with one finger. The engine's been running increasingly rich on this bank without anyone catching it because it happened gradually. Gradual enough that nothing tripped a threshold. Ray stood up from his chair, slowly, like a man who wasn't sure he was allowed to do what he wanted to do, which was walk over and see for himself. He stopped. That would explain the fuel consumption numbers last month. "What numbers?" Cole said. "I thought it was an injector starting to go. Mileage was off, but not enough to chase. I made a note to check it at the next service." Ray looked at the runner. Then he looked at Evelyn. "How did you—" "Because I knew to look for it," she said simply. Diagnostic system looks for hard failures, clean breaks, things that cross a threshold and stay crossed. It doesn't look for drift. It doesn't look for something that's been getting incrementally worse over 30 or 40 running hours. She began working the runner with the care of someone who understood that the problem was not just what was there, but how it got there and what removing it wrong could do. The computer sees a snapshot. It doesn't see a story. Raj was so quiet that the sound of the feeler gauge moving was audible. Peterson had taken 3 steps closer without appearing to realize he'd done it. He was watching her hands. His tablet had gone to its lock screen. Adrian Cross was watching Peterson. It took her 11 minutes to address the intake restriction. Not because the work was slow, because it was precise and economical in a way that communicated deep fluency, but because removing it incorrectly would have created a secondary problem, and Evelyn was not interested in creating secondary problems. When she was done, she set the removed debris on a shop rag on the workbench, a small clump of material and buildup, and something else, a tiny fragment of gasket material from an old repair, and placed it where everyone could see it. "That's it?" Adrian said. There was real hope in his voice, but the wrong kind of hope, the hope that this was the only problem, and it was insufficient to fix the engine, which would confirm what he needed confirmed. No, Evelyn said, already moving. That's the first thing. Adrian's expression tightened very slightly, a small recalibration, really visible, unless you were looking for it. Cole was looking for it. Evelyn's hands went to the timing system. She didn't ask Ray where the timing light was. She went directly to the lower drawer, on the right side of the toolbox, third from the bottom, and came up with it. Ray made a sound. What? Danny said, looking at him. That's where I keep the timing light, Ray said, very slowly. I moved it there 2 months ago. Nobody knew I moved it there. I didn't tell anyone. The toolbox drawer was closed. Evelyn was already connecting the timing light to the #1 cylinder lead. Go looked at Ray. Ray looked at the toolbox. Then Ray looked at Evelyn's back with an expression that had moved through surprise and was now somewhere in the territory of something much larger. Ray said quietly, I know. Cole said he was watching Evelyn work with his arms crossed and his jaw still tight, but something in his posture had changed. Some of the held weight had shifted. No, Cole. I moved that timing light 2 months ago because I was reorganizing the chest. I didn't tell you. I didn't tell Danny. I didn't tell anyone in this club. He paused. She knew exactly where it was. Cole said nothing. Toolbox before. Ray said, a lot. He was. You don't know a toolbox like that from watching someone else use it. Cole looked at Evelyn's back, at her hands. At the timing light, which was now showing him something he could read. The timing was off. Not enormously, not catastrophically, but consistently, systematically off in a way that would compound with the fuel restriction to create exactly the symptoms they'd been seeing. Flagged the timing as normal. Peterson said from somewhere behind Cole. He said it quietly, and there was no defensiveness in it, just observation. The kind of observation a man makes when he's trying to understand how he missed something. The computer was reading the camshaft position sensor, Evelyn said, not breaking her concentration. The sensor's fine. The issue isn't in the sensor, it's in what the sensor is referencing. Timing chain is stretched. Not enough to throw a code, just enough to put you 4 degrees off at idle. She adjusted. Checked. Adjusted again. 4 degrees doesn't sound like much until you add it to a fuel lean condition on one bank and cold start demands on a V12 with a compression ratio this high. Then it sounds like a lot, Ray finished very quietly. Then it sounds like a lot, Evelyn confirmed. She ran the timing check 3 times, made 2 small adjustments, put the timing light back in the lower right drawer, third from the bottom. Adrian Cross looked at his lead engineer. The engineer looked back at him with an expression that communicated something Adrian hadn't paid for and didn't want. Okay, Adrian said, pulling himself back to the performance of confidence. 2 problems found. Minor things, really, things that anyone could have. Peterson. Evelyn said the name without turning around. Thermal imaging. Did you run it on the electrical system? We did. Did you go beneath the secondary fuse block? Not the accessible side. Another pause. Longer. We imaged from above, Peterson said. There's a corroded ground connection on the underside of the secondary fuse block, Evelyn said. It's not causing a complete open circuit. If it were, you'd see it immediately. It's causing intermittent resistance, variable resistance, which means sometimes enough current gets through to make the system behave almost normally. She moved toward the fuse block, and sometimes it doesn't. The room held very still. Resistance on a ground connection is almost impossible to catch with a standard scan, she continued, because the scanner reads the circuit when everything is connected. The moment you probe it, you change the conditions slightly. The resistance drops, the reading comes up clean. You put the probe away, the resistance comes back. She crouched down near the secondary fuse block. You have to know it's there to look for it, and you have to look from the right angle. Peterson sat down on the stool that Big Ray had vacated. He sat down like a man who needed to sit down. That's why every diagnostic came up clean, he said. Not a question, just a man following a thread to where it led. The act of running the diagnostic temporarily resolved the fault. Every time, Evelyn said, the engine would have passed a scan in a shop environment, might even have started. Then the resistance would climb again under thermal load, current would drop below the threshold the ignition system needed, and she'd cut out. She looked at the fuse block with what might have been almost fondness, the way an experienced diagnostician looks at a problem that has been particularly clever. It's a ghost fault. Engine computers hate ghost faults. Human beings with experience can find them. Human beings with experience, Adrian said from the center of the garage. His voice had changed. Something in the architecture of it had shifted. The pleasant, casual confidence was still there as a structure, but the foundation felt different, like a building that looks the same from the outside, but something has moved underneath it. You're describing yourself as experienced. He said it carefully, like he was choosing each word. Experienced in automotive engineering. Evelyn looked at him over her shoulder, just briefly. I'm describing myself as someone who knows how to find a ghost fault, she said. She turned back to the fuse block. What happened next took 14 minutes. Later, when people told the story, and they would tell it for years, in the garage, at events, tables in diners and bars and anywhere, two people who'd been present that day ended up in the same room. They described those 14 minutes differently. To Marco, it felt like watching something extraordinary pretend to be ordinary. To Danny, it felt like watching someone diffuse something, that specific combination of absolute concentration and terrible stakes. To Big Ray, it felt like watching someone speak a language he'd spent his whole life learning and realizing for the first time that he'd only ever learned to converse. He'd never been fluent, not like this. Evelyn worked the corroded ground connection with a combination of chemical contact cleaner, a wire brush so fine it was almost delicate, and a retermination technique that involved a specific crimping sequence she performed by feel. She didn't rush, she didn't perform for the room. She was simply inside the problem, which is the only place you can be when the problem is real and the stakes are real and the solution requires everything you know. Peterson had gotten back up from his stool and moved to where he could see her hands. One of his engineers had done the same. They were watching the way you watch someone do something you've been trained to do and realize that your training only went so far. The second engineer, a younger man named Carver, who hadn't said anything since they arrived, made a sound at one point. Short, involuntary sound, barely audible. What? Peterson said. That crimping sequence, Carver said quietly. I've only seen that written about. In a technical paper from He stopped. From where? Peterson said. Carver looked at Evelyn's back, at her hands, then at Peterson. A paper published about 12 years ago, Carver said. Very slowly. About thermal cycle resistant retermination methods for high vibration automotive applications. He paused. I had to dig to find that paper. It was published by someone at Midwest Engineering Research Institute. Another pause, longer. Don't, Evelyn said, not sharply, not desperately, just cleanly. The single word of someone who knew exactly what was being said and had made a decision about it a long time ago. Stopped. Peterson looked at Carver, then at Evelyn, then at the fuse block where her hands were completing the retermination with the precise finish of someone who had done this, or something very like this, hundreds of times. Raj heard none of this, or most of it didn't. Cole was close enough to see that something had passed between Peterson and his engineer. Some recognition, some information being withheld by mutual quiet agreement. He filed it. Adrian was watching Cole watch Peterson. Adrian Cross was very good at watching people watch other people. It was one of the skills that had made him successful. You learned more from watching a man watch something than from watching the thing itself. He saw in Cole's face was not what he'd expected to see when he walked into this garage 18 hours ago. He'd expected to see defeat by now. Okay, Evelyn said. She stood up. She rolled her shoulders once, the brief automatic movement of someone who'd been in a position that asked something of their body and was acknowledging the ask without complaint. There's one more thing. The room reacted. Not loudly, the room had learned, in the last 40 minutes, to react quietly. But there was movement. A collective intake that wasn't quite breath. More, Adrian said. Something had changed in him. Not visible in his expression, which was still composed, still carrying that confident architecture. In his stillness. He had gone very still in a way that was different from his earlier stillness. He'd been still the way a man is still, when he's waiting for confirmation of something he already knows. He was still the way a man is still when he's not sure what's coming, and has stopped pretending otherwise. Fuel delivery, Evelyn said. The restriction I removed was the primary cause, but it wasn't the only fuel issue. The debris that built up in that runner created back pressure over time. Back pressure that the regulator compensated for by increasing delivery pressure slightly. When the restriction was there, that pressure was absorbed. Now that it's gone, the pressure is too high, Ray said. He was on his feet, had been for the last 10 minutes. High enough to push the injectors past their optimal spray pattern, Evelyn confirmed. And he was. Not enough to cause visible problems, enough to cause a cold start hesitation on a V12 that's already dealing with timing and electrical issues. She looked at the fuel rail. Regulator needs to come down about 4 psi. How do you know it's 4? Marco said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. It just came out. Evelyn looked at him. Because I know what the regulator is speaked at for a V12 with these injectors, and I know what the back pressure curve looks like for a restriction of that size over that time period. And I know what the compensation algorithm in this fuel management system does under those conditions. She held his eyes for a moment, and because I've done this before, Marco nodded slowly. He looked like a man whose world had just rearranged its furniture without asking him first. Evelyn went to the fuel rail. The adjustment was smaller than everything that came before it, technically simpler, requiring precision but not the extended diagnostic work of the earlier steps. She made it in 3 minutes, verified it, made a half-unit correction to her correction, verified again. Then she stepped back from the truck. She picked up a shop rag and wiped her hands. Methodical, like she'd done it 1,000 times after 1,000 sessions of work, just like this. Came off mostly, not all of it. Some of it had already settled into the creases of her knuckles the way it always did, the way it had always done, going back further than she talked about. Raj was completely silent. She looked at Cole, Evelyn said. Cole looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was still tight, but his eyes were something else now. Not cautious, not skeptical. Something a man who has carried something heavy for a long time looks like when he sees someone reach for it. Sure, he said, I'm sure. He looked at the truck, then at his club, Danny and Ray, and Marco, and 8 others who'd been standing in that garage through 45 minutes of something none of them had words for yet. Then he looked at Adrian Cross. Adrian Cross had his phone in his hand, held loosely at his side. His expression was composed. His jaw was tight in a way that was different from Cole's not holding weight carefully, but holding something back, something that was trying to get out through the composure and hadn't managed it yet. We ready? Cole said. Nobody said anything against it. Cole Harrison walked to the driver's door of the V12 Custom, hand on the handle. He paused there for just one moment, long enough to be human, long enough to acknowledge what this moment was, what was on the other side of the key turning and what was on the other side of it not turning. Then he opened the door and climbed in. The garage held its breath, took one step forward, just one, Cole. His voice was controlled and pleasant, almost. For what it's worth, this has been impressive, genuinely. But the independent assessment established that this engine, key turned. For 1 second, full, terrible, expanding second, nothing happened. Adrian opened his mouth. The V12 erupted. Not started. Not turned over. Erupted the way a thing comes back to life when everything that was blocking it is gone, and all the energy that's been waiting has somewhere to go. The sound was enormous, and it was immediate, and it filled the garage the way a wave fills a space, pressing against every surface, shaking the workbenches, rattling the tools on their hooks. Cole revved it once, not showing off, confirming, listening to it the way you listen to something you love after it's been sick, and you need to know it's really, truly well. The engine answered him cleanly. No hesitation, no roughness. Just the full, even, thunderous authority of 22 years of brotherhood brought back from the edge by a woman who had never, not once in 3 years, been seen. The bikers erupted. Marco threw his arms up. Danny grabbed Ray by the shoulder. 2 men who had not hugged each other in living memory grabbed each other. Was shouting just wordlessly, just sound, the specific kind of noise that comes out of a person when relief is too big for language. Big Ray sat back down on his stool. He put his face in his hand. His shoulders shook once. Cole sat in the driver's seat with the engine running beneath him, his eyes forward, his hands on the wheel. He didn't celebrate. He breathed. Evelyn Carter stood where she'd been standing when she said she'll start. She hadn't moved. She'd put the shop rag down on the workbench. Hands were at her sides. She watched the room. She watched Cole's hands on the wheel. She watched Marco with his arms still in the air. She watched Ray's face in his hands. She watched Danny, hard, careful Danny, who didn't much standing with his hand on his brother's shoulder and his eyes bright in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lights. She let herself have exactly this much of it, this exact amount. The way you let yourself have something you haven't let yourself have in a long time, carefully, aware that too much of it might undo something you've spent years learning to hold together. Then she picked up the shop rag and she turned toward Adrian Cross, standing in the center of the garage, with his engineers around him and his phone in his hand and the composed expression, doing the hardest work it had ever done. The V12 was still running, would keep running. Anyone in that room could hear it, not just that it was running, but how it was running. The specific, even healthy authority of it. Peterson could hear it. Carver could hear it. Every one of the men who'd come into that garage with calibrated equipment and professional certainty could hear it. She was. And they could hear what it meant. That, said Cole Harrison, from the driver's seat, his voice carrying over the engine, is what that sounds like. Adrian Cross looked at the envelope he'd placed on that workbench 24 hours ago. Moved. Just slightly, just enough. The terms of your offer, Cole said, climbing down from the truck, that if the truck runs, you write the check and walk away. He stood in front of Adrian, 2 inches shorter and 15 years older, and carrying something in his posture that had nothing to do with height or age. We heard you. Room full of witnesses. Adrian was quiet for 3 seconds, and a very long time. Then he reached into his jacket. I'll need the account information for the payment transfer, he said. Perfectly level. Cole looked at him with the eyes of a man who had expected something like anger or argument and found instead someone who understood loss well enough to sustain it quietly. It changed how he felt about the moment, not softened it, changed it. The way clean resolution often changes things, leaving something that's almost, but not quite, satisfaction. He gave Adrian the account information. Adrian typed it into his phone, made the transfer, held up the screen for Cole to see. The confirmation code. Then he pocketed his phone, buttoned his jacket, and looked at Evelyn Carter. She was looking back at him. He held the look for a moment. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite any single emotion. Not embarrassment, not anger, not admiration. Something made of all three and more complicated than any of them. Very good, he said, quietly, just to her, at what you do. Evelyn said nothing. Adrian nodded once, as though she'd said something. Then he turned and walked toward the garage door. His engineers followed. Peterson stopped at the threshold and turned back. He looked at Evelyn across the length of the garage. He opened his mouth as though he was going to say something, then appeared to reconsider. He settled on was a single deliberate nod. Evelyn returned it. Then Peterson walked out. The garage was loud now. The engine still running, the club celebrating. Someone had turned on music from somewhere. Marco was telling anyone who would listen that he knew. He had known something was different. He had said something was different, but beneath all of that, in the specific quiet that Evelyn occupied wherever she stood, something had shifted. She pulled a stool up near the workbench and sat down. She was tired. Not the tired of age or defeat, but the productive tired of someone who has worked hard at something that mattered and used everything they had and spent it well. Ray appeared beside her. He put a coffee on the workbench without asking if she wanted it. 2 sugars, which was how Evelyn took it when she made it herself in the back room before anyone else arrived. She looked at the coffee. She looked at Ray. Ray looked at the toolbox drawer from the bottom on the right side. You moved it, he said. Didn't you? Before I reorganized the chest, that's where you'd had it. Evelyn wrapped her hands around the coffee. That drawer made sense for it. Ray nodded very slowly. Yeah, he said, it does. He sat down on the stool next to hers. Neither of them said anything for a while. The V12 ran on, steady and even and alive, filling the garage with everything it had been holding back. Outside, somewhere in the parking lot, Adrian Cross sat in his black SUV for a long time before he started the engine. He was thinking about how he'd walked in here with the full weight of money and expertise and certainty, and been undone by a woman with a feeler gauge and a shop rag. Not defeated by luck, not beaten by chance, undone by someone who simply understood at a depth that all his money couldn't measure what he had never understood at all. He thought about that for a long time. Then he drove away. The charity ride happened on Saturday, 214 motorcycles. The V12 Custom leading the column like it always had, like it was built to do, like nothing had ever threatened to stop it. Cole Harrison behind the wheel with his window down and his arm resting on the door, the way a man rests his arm when he's somewhere he belongs. The sound of the procession carrying across 3 counties, people standing on the sides of roads they'd driven 1,000 times, stopping, watching, some of them not entirely sure why they felt what they felt when the truck passed. Evelyn didn't go. She wasn't asked and she hadn't expected to be. She watched from the parking lot as the last bikes rolled out, then went back inside and finished cleaning the bathroom that nobody ever cleaned, and then she went home. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Stories spread the way. Stories spread in small towns not through news or announcement, but through the specific, unstoppable current of people telling other people things they couldn't quite believe, but absolutely needed to share. By Sunday morning, half of Redwood Falls knew that the Hells Angels janitor had fixed the truck that 3 professional engineering teams couldn't touch. Sunday afternoon, someone had added details that weren't entirely accurate, but were emotionally true. Sunday evening, Evelyn Carter had become a story. She found out Monday morning when she showed up at the garage, and there were 7 people waiting outside who had nothing to do with the club. A woman with a 2003 Dodge Ram that had been throwing a code for 6 months. His son's truck had been quoted at $4,200 in repairs by 3 different shops, and he didn't trust any of them. A retired teacher with a question about her late husband's restored Pontiac that she couldn't bring herself to sell, but couldn't figure out how to keep running. They were standing in the parking lot like they weren't sure they were allowed to be there, like they'd come to a place that might tell them to leave, and they'd come anyway because they didn't know where else to go about. Evelyn stood at the side door with her key in the lock and looked at them. "I'm the janitor," she said. "We know," the woman with the Dodge said. "We still came." Cole found out about the parking lot people when Danny called him at 7:45 a.m. He arrived at the garage to find Evelyn in the parking lot beside the Dodge Ram, her head under the hood, while the owner stood beside her with her arms crossed, and the specific look of a woman who has been told her vehicle is a lost cause by enough men that she stopped expecting anything different. Cole stood at the garage entrance and watched for a moment. Evelyn said something to the woman. The woman uncrossed her arms. Evelyn said something else. The woman made a sound that was half laugh and half the particular exhale of someone who has been holding their breath about something for a long time. Cole walked over Ev. She looked up from under the hood. Cole. He looked at the other 6 people standing in his parking lot, at the Dodge Ram, at the notebook in Evelyn's jacket pocket that she'd pulled out and opened. "What are you doing?" he said. "Talking to people. Their cars." "Yes." Cole put his hands in his jacket pockets. And he was. He looked at the woman with the Dodge, who was watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone who wasn't sure if she was about to be told to leave. "You're going to fix their cars," Cole said. It wasn't a question exactly. "I'm going to look at their cars," Evelyn said. "Then I'll know what I can do." He stood there for a moment. Something he wanted to ask her, had been wanting to ask her since Friday afternoon, when Peterson's engineer had stopped mid-sentence and Evelyn had said "don't" in that quiet, clean way that closed a door without slamming it. He was still carrying it. "We need to talk," he said. "No," she said. She closed the Dodge's hood gently. "After I'm done here." Cole looked at the people in his parking lot. Then he looked at Evelyn. "Use Bay 3, he said. "Got the best light." He walked back into the garage. Danny was waiting just inside the door with his coffee and his expression. "You're just going to let her?" "Yes," Cole said. "We don't know anything about her, Cole. We don't know who she—" "I know." Cole said that she saved this club on Friday. "I know that she's been here 3 years and never asked for anything and never caused a problem and knows where Ray keeps his timing light." He poured himself a coffee. "I know enough." The conversation happened at 2 in the afternoon, when the parking lot people had been seen and the garage had cleared out and Evelyn had washed her hands in the bay sink with the concentration of someone who treats ordinary things with care. Sat on one stool, Evelyn sat on another. He put a coffee in front of her, black, 2 sugars, the same way Ray had done it Friday, and she took it without comment, which told him Ray had already done it this way, and she hadn't corrected it. He let the silence sit for a moment. Cole Harrison was a man who understood that there were conversations you couldn't rush, and that trying to rush them was how you got the surface version of a thing instead of the real thing underneath. Peterson's engineer, Cole said, he started to say something Friday about a technical paper, and you stopped him. Evelyn held the coffee with both hands. She was quiet. Evie. Retermination method, she said. For high-vibration automotive applications. And you wrote it. She didn't answer, which was its own answer. Cole said. Midwest Engineering Research Institute, she said. 12 years ago. Cole absorbed that. You were an automotive engineer. Comma in it. Just fact. For a long time. Happened. She looked at the coffee. Then at the truck. Still in Bay 2. Quiet now. The V12 at rest. She looked at it the way she'd looked at it Thursday night, from the overturned crate with familiarity, with something that went beyond professional interest into something more personal. I built things, she said finally, engine systems, advanced diagnostics. Some of it ended up in vehicles that sold in the millions. Some of it ended up in technical papers that engineers like Peterson's kid read in school. A pause. And then someone decided that what I'd built belonged to them. Legally. They had the documentation. I had the knowledge, but not the paperwork. She stopped. You know how those situations go. Corporate, she agreed. A man I trusted, a company I'd given 12 years to. They restructured around my division, reclassified my work as collaborative output, and walked away with everything I'd designed. I could have fought it. I didn't have the money, or she stopped. David was sick by then. My husband, he needed me present. Not in a courtroom. Cole said nothing for a moment. How long was he sick? 2 years. He passed 4 years ago. I'm sorry. Thank you. Said simply, way people say it when they've received condolences enough times, that the words have become a specific shape appreciated, familiar, insufficient. And yet, after that, she said, I just needed things to be quiet for a while. I needed to be somewhere people didn't know me. Somewhere I could think without. She paused, out caring who I used to be everywhere I went. She looked at Cole. Redwood Falls was quiet. The job here was available. And you pay on time and you leave me alone, which was everything I needed. Cole turned his coffee cup slowly on the workbench. And now you're not anonymous anymore. No, because of Friday. Yes, he looked at her. Do you regret it? She thought about that. And he was. Really thought about it. The way she thought about mechanical problems, following the logic, seeing where it led, not committing to an answer before the answer was ready. She said, I couldn't watch you lose this place and do nothing. I had the ability to do something. She paused. That's not a choice, really. If you can do something and you don't, that's also a choice. I just couldn't make that one. Cole nodded slowly. Then he said, the thing he'd been building toward for the last 10 minutes. What did they take from you, Ev? Specifically, what was it that you built? Quiet for a long moment. An engine diagnostic system, she said. An approach to failure analysis that worked differently from what existed at the time. Instead of scanning for threshold violations, instead of looking for things that were clearly measurably broken, map the relationship between systems. It looked for drift, for patterns across multiple small readings that individually meant nothing but together pointed to something. She paused. The way a doctor listens to a patient, not just reads the blood work. Cole stared at her. That's what you did Friday, he said. That's exactly what you did. You didn't find one thing wrong. You found 3 things that were each almost invisible, and you understood how they were connected. Yes. And someone took that system. They built a version of it. Then what I designed, it's in 3 major diagnostic platforms now. She said it without bitterness. The bitterness had been there. Once she didn't pretend it hadn't. But it had gone through enough seasons to become something else. Something heavier and quieter. You might have seen it. It's the kind of software that finds half of what the problem is and gives you a confident reading about the other half not existing. And exhaled. Peterson's software. The generation that followed mine. He sat with that for a long time. The garage was quiet around them. The V12 at rest. The toolbox against the wall. The timing light in its drawer. 3rd from the bottom on the right side. What would the real version look like? Cole said. The one you designed. Evelyn looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, if you built it, if you did it right, what would it look like? She held his eyes for a moment, and then she looked away, and something moved across her face, not quite hope, not yet. And he was something earlier than hope, and the thing that exists in the moment, before a person decides they're allowed to want something again. Like what I did Friday, she said, except faster, teachable. Cole nodded once. He didn't say anything else about it then. He filed the way he'd filed the engineer's unfinished sentence and the timing light in its drawer and the way Evelyn's hands had moved through that toolbox like coming home. Adrian Cross heard about the parking lot by Monday afternoon. He heard about it through channels he maintained for exactly this kind of information, a network of contacts in Redwood Falls who understood that passing along relevant news about properties and businesses he had interest in was worth their while. The information came to him clean and simple. The Hells Angels janitor had been diagnosing cars in the club parking lot all morning. People were calling her. By the time he heard about it, there were 11 of them. He sat in his office and thought about it. He thought about Evelyn Carter standing in that garage with grease on her hands and the perfectly level voice of someone who understood something deeply and had nothing to prove and knew it. He thought about the way Peterson, who he paid well and trusted professionally, had sat down on that stool like his legs decided for him. He thought about Carver stopping mid-sentence. He thought about the technical paper. He'd looked it up Friday night after he left. It took him 40 minutes to find because it was published under a name he didn't know and in a journal that didn't come up in standard searches. But he found it. He read it twice. Then he did something he rarely did. He called someone to ask for an opinion rather than an instruction. The man he called was an older engineer named Sattler, who had been in the automotive industry for 30 years and who Adrian had used once before as a consultant on an acquisition that involved significant technical assets. Sattler was expensive and precise and allergic to flattery, which made his opinions reliable. "The paper I'm sending you," Adrian said, "I need to know what it represents. Behind it would be worth." He sent the PDF. Sattler called back in 2 hours. "Where did you find this?" was the first thing he said. "Does it matter?" "It matters because this paper was not widely circulated, and the person who wrote it disappeared from the industry shortly after publication, and nobody has been able to follow the work." A pause. "This methodology, if it was fully developed, if there's more behind it than what's published here, Adrian, this is the kind of foundational work that major diagnostic platforms are still trying to replicate. The version in use now is a rough approximation. The real version, would the real version be worth?" A longer pause. Sattler thinking carefully, conservatively, as a licensed platform. Tens of millions, possibly more depending on implementation and market penetration. Another pause. "Where are they?" Adrian Cross was quiet for a moment. "Working on it," he said. He hung up. He sat in his office for a long time after that. The charity ride had happened. The truck had run. The $60,000 had transferred. By the narrow terms of the agreement he'd proposed, he'd lost. Adrian Cross did not think in narrow terms. What had happened Friday was not a loss. It was a discovery. The most expensive discovery he'd made in years, and he'd made it for the price of $60,000 and an afternoon of professional embarrassment. He now knew something that almost nobody else knew. Evelyn Carter was not a janitor. She was the closest thing to a lost masterwork the automotive engineering world had produced in 20 years. She was living quietly in Redwood Falls, Montana, mopping floors and going unnoticed. He opened his laptop and began making calls. Evelyn noticed the car on Tuesday, across the street from the garage in a position that was technically unremarkable, a gray sedan. Ordinary make, ordinary color, the kind of vehicle that announces nothing. It was there Tuesday morning when she arrived, and there when she left, and back Wednesday morning in a slightly different spot that was otherwise the same position. She noticed because she paid attention to things. She always had. It was the same quality that made her a good diagnostician, the ability to register small deviations from baseline. The car was a deviation. She didn't mention it to Cole, yet she filed it. Wednesday brought more people to the parking lot. By midday, word had moved past Redwood Falls. Someone had posted something on a local community page, and a mechanic from Helena had driven 2 hours with a truck that had stumped his shop for 3 weeks. Evelyn looked at the truck, gave the mechanic her assessment in 12 minutes, told him what his shop had missed and why and what to do about it. He stood there with the expression of a man who wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or embarrassed. "Don't be embarrassed," Evelyn said. "Your equipment is looking in the right places for the wrong problems. It's not a failing, it's a design limitation. Can I bring you other cases, he said. She looked at him. You drove 2 hours, I'll drive 4. Whatever you need. She put his number in her phone. Not the smartphone everyone expected. A plain flip phone old turns. Deliberate, not apps or cameras or GPS. The kind of phone that a person carries when they've decided to be present in the world they're actually in, rather than the one on the screen. Watched the mechanic from Helena drive away and appeared at Evelyn's shoulder. You know you can't keep doing this in a parking lot, he said. I know. Cole's thinking about the back bay, giving you a proper space. She looked at him. What do you know about what Cole's thinking? Because he asked me this morning if Bay 4 could run a full diagnostic setup. And I told him yes, and he said good and walked away. Ray shrugged. Cole's not a complicated man when he's made a decision. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. I don't want to. She stopped. Don't want to what? I don't want to become something I'm not ready to become again, she said. Precisely the way she said most things. Ray looked at her. This was the most personal thing she'd said in 3 years. He stood that and treated it accordingly, which meant he didn't push and he didn't offer platitudes and he didn't fill the space with reassurance she hadn't asked for. Okay, he said, but the parking lot's got bad drainage and it's supposed to rain Thursday. She almost smiled. Okay. The man who came on Thursday was not there about a car. He arrived in a rental, not the gray sedan, Miracles, a different Newers, and he was dressed in business casual in a way that was too considered for Redwood Falls. It's too precise. The kind of outfit that communicated, I'm trying to look approachable without quite achieving it. He was in his 50s, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who'd spent a long time in professional environments and had the confidence that came from being reliably right about things. He asked for Evelyn by name. Danny was at the front, and Danny had developed in the last 4 days a specific instinct about people who came asking for Evelyn by name. Some of them were mechanics with difficult problems. Some of them were regular people with cars and nowhere else to go. And some of them had the look of this man, which was the look of someone who had come for a different reason. She's busy, Danny said. I'll wait. Could be a while. I've got time. Danny went and found Evelyn in Bay 4. Cole had set up a basic workspace, a proper lift, better lighting, the toolbox from Bay 3, and a folding table that currently had her composition notebook on it, and 3 sheets of hand-drawn diagnostic maps that looked like nothing so much as engineering schematics. And out front, Danny said. Didn't say what he wants, didn't show a card, just asked for you by name and said he'd wait. Evelyn looked up. What does he look like? Danny described him. She was still for a moment. Tall, silver hair, walks like he's used to the front of rooms. Send him back, she said. Danny looked at her. You know him? She set down her pencil. His name is Gerald Sadler, she said. He's one of the best engineering consultants in the industry. A pause. Last time I saw him was at a conference in Detroit 11 years ago, giving a keynote. He referenced my work twice without knowing I was in the room. And he absorbed this. Should I be worried? He said. Evelyn picked her pencil back up. About Sadler? No. About whoever sent him? She made a mark on the diagnostic map. Probably yes. Sadler walked into Bay 4 and stopped. He took in the space, the lift, the toolbox, the table, with the composition notebook and the hand-drawn schematics. He took in Evelyn, who hadn't stood up or offered her hand, but was watching him with the specific attention of someone who has learned to assess situations from a distance before committing. And Carter, he said. Gerald. He looked at the schematics on the table. He stood, he couldn't read them clearly, but the shape of the structure, the relational mapping of system components, rather than linear diagnostic flow was enough. Still working on it, he said. I never stopped working on it, she said. I just stopped having a lab. He pulled a stool over without asking and sat down. He didn't perform his authority or his credentials. He'd been in enough rooms with enough exceptional people to know that performance was what you did when you weren't sure you'd be taken seriously on your actual merits. Who sent you? Evelyn said. I was hired as a consultant by someone with an interest in your work. Adrian Cross. Sadler's expression didn't change in the way the expression of a man who's been caught changes. It changed in the way the expression of a man who expected to be caught changes. He wants to monetize what I know. He wants to acquire your methodology. Yes. Evelyn put down her pencil. She looked at Sadler directly. And he held the look. He was one of the few people she'd encountered who could hold her look without performance. Gerald, she said, why are you here personally? You could have sent someone junior. You could have sent a letter through a firm. Why did you drive here yourself? Saller was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because when Cross told me who he'd found, I didn't believe him. And then I looked at the paper, personally, because he stopped. Because if what I think is behind that paper is actually real, it needed someone with the standing to represent it properly. Not a junior associate to represent it to Cross. Present it to you, he said. From Cross's side, yes. Evelyn, he stopped again, and something shifted in his carefully composed professional manner. Something more human came through. I owe you an apology. I referenced your work at that conference, and I didn't know whose it was. Researcher found the paper without a full attribution chain. By the time I found out the author was you, you were already gone from the industry. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. What did Cross tell you to offer? She said. Sadler named a number. It was large enough that if she'd been the kind of person who reacted visibly to numbers, she would have reacted. She wasn't. For the methodology, she said, for an exclusive license. 10 years, full attribution, she said. Like the last company that promised me that. Sadler had the decency not to flinch from that. I understand the weight of that statement. Do you? I do, he paused. The legal structure Cross is proposing is different from what was done to you before. The exclusivity would be contractually defined. The attribution would be binding. I've seen the framework. You've seen the framework Adrian Cross gave you to show me. Yes. Evelyn picked up her pencil. She looked at the diagnostic map in front of her. She made a slow mark that had nothing to do with what they were discussing, and everything to do with the fact that her hands worked better when they were doing something. Tell Adrian Cross, she said, that I'll think about it. Sadler nodded, stood, picked up his stool and put it back. At the entrance to the bay, he paused. Evelyn, he turned back. Version that's in the market. Now, the diagnostic platform based on your work. Crude version. He looked at her directly. How much better is what you actually designed? She held his eyes. About as much better, she said, as listening to a patient is better than reading their chart. Sadler was quiet. Then he said, I thought as much. And he left. Evelyn sat alone in Bay 4. She looked at the diagnostic map. She thought about Sadler. She thought about Adrian Cross sitting somewhere in a room, having converted his $60,000 loss into what he believed was the opening position of a much larger acquisition. She thought about the way Cole had asked what the real version would look like. The way Ray had said, Bay's yours if you want it. The way Marco had stood in her parking lot and watched her work with the expression of someone discovering for the first time what was possible. She thought about Tommy Briggs, who she'd never met, who had built that intake manifold by hand with references tighter than spec because he understood the machine he was building it for and what it needed. She thought about David, who had said to her once, in one of the last conversations they had when he was still well enough for the kind of conversations that go somewhere, Evelyn, the only thing worse than losing something is deciding it's permanently lost. She opened the composition notebook to a fresh page. She wrote 2 words at the top, not for Cross, not for Sadler, not for anyone else yet, just for the work, just for the thing she'd never stopped knowing was true. She wrote, what if? And she started drawing. Outside the bay, unseen, Cole Harris stood at the corner of the garage entrance. He'd come to check on something and heard the last piece of the conversation, not all of it, just the end. Just Sadler saying, I thought as much, and the sound of footsteps leaving. He stood there for a moment, looking at Evelyn through the bay entrance at her, bent over the table with her pencil moving, and the composition notebook open, and the diagnostic maps around her, and he thought about what it cost a person to set something down for. It was long enough that the world forgot they'd ever held it, and what it might look like when they picked it back up. He turned and walked quietly back toward the front of the garage. He had some phone calls to make, people who owed him favors, people who knew people, people who understood contracts and intellectual property, and how to make sure that when someone with everything tried to own someone with nothing except the most valuable knowledge in the room, and with nothing, walked away with what was theirs. Cole Harrison was not a man who had ever trusted the other kind, and Evelyn Carter had saved his house. He intended to return the favor. Cole made his first call Thursday night at 9:15, sitting at the kitchen table in his house with a yellow legal pad in front of him and a pen he kept clicking and unclicking without noticing. The man he called was named Walt Greer. Walt was a retired attorney who had spent 28 years in intellectual property law before deciding he'd rather raise cattle in the Bitterroot Valley than spend another winter in Chicago. Cole had met him 6 years ago when the club had a trademark dispute with a commercial apparel company that was using their insignia on mass-produced merchandise. Walt had resolved it in 11 days and charged them half his standard rate because, as he put it, anyone who builds something and fights to keep it deserves a fair shot. Walt picked up on the third ring. "Cole Harrison," he said, with the voice of a man who was surprised and not surprised simultaneously. 9 o'clock, I know. I need your head on something. Is this club business? It's people business, Cole said. Someone I want to protect. Walt was quiet for a moment. In the background, Cole could hear the specific quiet of a rural property at night, no traffic, just the kind of silence that has texture. Cole told him, not everything, he didn't have everything. But what he had, Evelyn's history, the corporate theft of her methodology, the paper carver had identified, Sadler's visit, Cross's offer that was framed as generosity but structured as acquisition. He told it clean and straight the way Walt had once told him to always tell things to lawyers, without editorializing, without the emotional weight, just the facts in sequence. Walt listened without interrupting until Cole was done. Then he said, how long ago did the original theft occur? 12 years, roughly. Has she filed anything? Any IP claims? Any documentation of prior art? I don't know. I need to find out. Get me whatever documentation she has. Notebooks, drafts, anything with dates. If her methodology predates what's currently in those commercial platforms. Walt stopped. Cole, depending on what she's got, this isn't just a defensive play. This could be affirmative. She may have claims she never pursued against the company that took it, and anyone who built commercially on it without authorization, which by the sound of it, Walt let that sit. Get me the documentation. And Cole, don't let her sign anything with Cross. Not a word, not a preliminary understanding, not a letter of intent. Nothing, understood. One more thing, this Sadler, he's consulting for Cross, which means he's Cross's man, but you said he seemed to have some personal regard for her work. That's how it read. People like Sadler have professional reputations that they value more than their consulting fees. If he's been in this industry long enough, and he knows the history, he knows he's standing next to something that isn't clean. Walt paused. He might be more useful to her than to Cross if she handles it right. Cole wrote that down. After he hung up, he sat with the legal pad for a moment. Then he wrote Evelyn's name at the top of the page, underlined it, and underneath wrote 2 words, what's hers? He looked at it. Then he went to bed because Saturday had taken something out of him that he was still replacing, and tomorrow was going to need everything he had. Evelyn came into Bay 4 Friday morning at 6 and found a message on the folding table. Not a text, she didn't get texts. The flip phone didn't receive them from most numbers in any usable way, but a handwritten note in Cole's particular handwriting, which was the handwriting of a man who had learned to write in an era when handwriting mattered and had never gotten worse at it. Don't sign anything with Cross or Sadler. I know someone. This Saturday, see. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her jacket pocket with her composition notebook and picked up her pencil. Maps had grown overnight. She'd come back after dinner she hadn't meant to, had driven home and eaten, and then found herself unable to do anything except sit in the silence of her house and think about Sadler's question, how much better is what you actually designed? So she'd driven back, let herself in with her key, sat in Bay 4 under the fluorescence with her notebook and her pencil, and the maps that were starting to look less like notes and more like architecture. Her methodology was still there, all of it. Not just the published part was the what, the shape of the approach, what lived behind it, in the notebooks she'd kept since graduate school, in the specific sequence of insights that had taken her from the original concept to the functional system she'd built and lost, was the why and the how, reasoning that made it work. The 12 years of iterative refinement that nobody else had because nobody else had done the work. The company that had taken it had taken the surface. They'd taken the description of the destination without the map of how to get there. which was why what they'd built was crude, which was why Peterson's software gave confident clean readings on engines that weren't clean. She knew the map, she'd drawn it over years. In notebooks like this one, notebooks she'd kept because she was the kind of person who wrote things down, who trusted paper more than servers, and who had learned early from her father, a machinist for 40 years, that the knowledge that mattered most lived in your hands and your notebooks and not in any system controlled by someone else. She pulled out the earliest notebook. She'd carried it with her for 12 years, through the loss and through David's illness and through 4 addresses and the decision to come to Redwood Falls and all the mornings in this garage. Fine, the cover soft from years of jacket pockets. Side, the earliest pages to when she was 36 years old and still at the Institute and still believed that the work would protect itself because it was good enough. She'd been wrong about that. She wasn't wrong about the work. Danny came into Bay 4 at 8:30 with a look on his face that Evelyn had learned to read in 3 years of being in the same building as him. It was his news, that isn't good look, which was different from his news, that is outright bad look in a specific and important way. The first meant something was happening that needed management. The second meant something had already happened that needed damage control. This was the first kind. Someone's been talking to people, he said. Asking about you. Evelyn set down her pencil. Asking. Careful kind. Not asking your name, people who don't know you by sight. Asking what kind of person you are. Reputation questions. He paused. Linda at the diner said a man came in yesterday afternoon asking whether the mechanic at the Hells Angels garage was someone people trusted. Linda told him yes and described you, and he thanked her and left. Evelyn was still. What did he look like? Danny described someone neither of them recognized. Sadler, not Cross, someone new. Cross is building a profile, Evelyn said. Not alarmed, just naming the thing clearly. He's establishing community standing before he moves. To know if I'm embedded here, whether there'd be pushback if he made a play. Kind of play. I don't know yet. She looked at the diagnostic maps on the table. He's not done. He didn't drive here for $60,000 and lose gracefully. He came here for something else and found something he didn't expect. She paused. He's reorienting. Danny crossed his arms. He had the posture of a man deciding something. What do you need? She looked at him. In 3 years, she had never asked Danny for anything, except occasionally where they kept extra trash bags. The question surprised her, not because it was unwelcome, but because she'd lived for long enough in her own self-sufficiency that someone asking, what do you need, still landed with a slight impact, like a hand extended when you've forgotten what it means to need one. She said, and for no one to tell me to be careful in a way that means be small. Danny looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said, nobody's going to tell you to be small. He left. Evelyn picked up her pencil. Adrian Cross came himself on Friday afternoon. He didn't send Sadler. He didn't send anyone. He came alone, which was either a gesture of sincerity or a calculated choice to appear sincere with Adrian. Evelyn had decided the distinction might not be as clear as it seemed because men like him had been performing sincerity long enough that parts of the performance had become genuine. He walked into Bay 4 and stood at the entrance in jeans and a plain jacket, no suit, no engineers, no staging. He looked younger this way, more like the person he might have been before the money had given him so many tools for avoiding difficulty. I owe you an apology, he said. Evelyn looked up from the table. She held his eyes and waited. What I said in the garage last week, he said. Of everyone. The janitor comment. He stopped. It again. That was I was being contemptible. And I knew I was being contemptible when I did it. I did it anyway. He paused. I wanted to diminish you before you had a chance to prove I should be paying attention. A short exhale, almost a laugh at his own expense. Did not work. Evelyn said nothing. I'm not asking you to accept that, he said. I'm telling you because you deserve to hear it and I'm capable of saying it even if I can't undo it. She looked at him for a long moment. She was good at reading the difference between a person performing remorse and a person experiencing it. Adrian Cross was somewhere in the middle, genuinely uncomfortable, genuinely aware of what he'd done, and not entirely sure the awareness was enough, which was, she supposed, more honest than most. Sit down, she said. He found a stool. Sat. Your offer, she said, through Sadler. What's the real structure? Exclusive license, 10 years, full attribution, the numbers Sattler quoted. The platform would carry your name on the methodology. The licensing revenue after year one would have a tiered structure. Stop, she said it quietly. Tell me what you get. He looked at her. Controlling interest in the platform it's built on. And after 10 years, renegotiation, where the leverage will have shifted entirely to the platform because by then it's market embed and I'm 10 years older and you have the customer base. She held his eyes. You've seen this structure before, Adrian. You've built it before. So have the people who took my work the first time. He didn't flinch from that. Yes. Then why would I? Because what I'm offering is better than what you have, he said, which is an informal operation in a motorcycle club's parking lot that he stopped, caught himself using his own name, a slight crack in the composure that people with resources could complicate very easily. Licensing disputes, zoning, the kind of legal attention that doesn't have to win to be expensive. He paused, not threatening. I'm telling you the landscape. You're telling me the landscape you're prepared to create if I don't deal with you. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. I'm not a good person, Adrian said. Was. And the way he said it was so stripped of anything except plainness that it landed differently than it would have if he'd dressed it up. I know that. I've known that for a while. But I'm a person who can see value. And what you have is Evelyn. What you have is worth more than either of us can fully calculate right now. I want to be the person who helps you do something with it, even if my reasons aren't purely generous. At least you're not pretending they are, she said. She looked at the diagnostic maps. She looked at the earliest notebook. She looked at a man sitting across from her with expensive jeans and a genuine attempt at honesty that was still fundamentally organized around what he could get because that was the operating system he ran on and probably didn't know how to reinstall. I need a week, she said. Cross you, she said. I'm talking to you, not Cross, because you're sitting in front of me and Cross is a character you perform when you're afraid of losing. She held his eyes. Give me a week. He was quiet. Then a week, he stood, picked up the stool, put it back where he'd found it, which she noticed. Then he looked at the table, at the maps, at the open notebook with its 12 years of accumulated knowledge, the map behind the map, the thing that made the published paper not a completed thought but a beginning. When Sattler called me after he read the paper, Adrian said, at the entrance to the bay, he asked me where I'd found you. He paused, and he was quiet for a long time. And then he said that the person who wrote that paper was the kind of engineer that comes along once in a generation, and that whoever had taken her work had cost the industry 20 years. He looked at her. I just thought you should know someone said that. Someone who would know. He left. Evelyn sat alone in Bay 4, her hand flat on the earliest notebook. 20 years was a long time to be owed. Was. Walt Greer arrived in Redwood Falls on Saturday morning in a pickup truck that had clearly seen actual ranch work, wearing clothes that made no concession to professional appearance, with a leather briefcase that looked like it had been on more legal cases than some courthouses. He and Cole and Evelyn sat at the long table in the back room of the garage, where the club held its meetings, with coffee and Walt's briefcase open between them. Show me what you have, Walt said to Evelyn. She put the notebooks on the table. 17 of them, spanning 12 years, each one dated on the inside cover in her consistent, careful hand. She put them in chronological order without being asked. Walt looked at them. He reached out and opened the first one carefully, with the respect of someone who understood that he was looking at primary documentation. He scanned the first few pages, looked at the dates, looked at the structure of the entries, then he closed it. These are contemporaneous, he said.
Yes, you dated every entry.
I dated every entry and I initialed the date. She opened to a page midway through the third notebook, because my father told me to. He was a machinist. He said document everything, because the only time documentation matters is when someone else is claiming something is theirs. Walt looked at Cole. Cole looked back at Walt with the expression of a man who had suspected something important and was watching the suspicion confirmed. Evelyn, Walt said, I want to ask you a direct question and I need a direct answer. When your methodology was incorporated into the platforms currently on the market, the commercial diagnostic systems, did any of those platforms exist before the methodology was developed? Can you demonstrate, through these notebooks, the development sequence of the methodology? Beginning, iterations, completion? Yes. And the patent filing that the company made on your work, do you know when it was filed? 2014. I still have the letter they sent me explaining why the filing was not in my name. Walt went very still. You have that letter? And he was. I have that letter, the original filing documentation they sent as notification, and 3 emails from the company's legal department explaining their position. She reached into her jacket and produced a folded envelope. Inside was a smaller folded paper, worn at the creases, handled enough times that the fold lines had gone soft. I've kept this for 11 years. Walt took it. Read it. Read it again. When he looked up, his expression was the specific, controlled expression of an attorney who has just identified something significant and is managing his reaction. Cole, he said. Yeah, I need to make some calls. Walt closed his briefcase. Evelyn, I want to be careful not to overstate what I'm seeing until I've done more work. But what you have here, the notebooks, the letter, the documentation sequence, this is not a small thing. He paused. The claims you may have against the original company, and by extension, anyone who licensed and commercialized their platform, are potentially substantial. And the position you're in, with Cross. Another pause, is not the position Cross thinks you're in. Evelyn looked at him steadily. What position am I in? Walt folded his hands on the table. You're not someone he's offering to help, Walt said. Someone he's trying to acquire before you find out what you're worth. And what you're worth, Evelyn, he glanced at the notebooks, is considerably more than he's offered. Considerably more than he probably knows. The room was quiet for a moment. Go knocked on the doorframe. He'd been waiting, in the hallway, not listening, or trying not to listen, because Cole had asked him to keep an eye out, and he'd taken that to mean stay close. He'd heard more than he'd intended. His expression was doing something complicated. Sorry, he said. There's someone at the front. The mechanic from Helena's back. 2 guys with him. A pause. They drove from Great Falls. Evelyn looked at Cole. Cole looked at Walt. Walt was already writing something on his legal pad. Cole said to Evelyn, Walt and I will be here. She stood, picked up her pencil, left the earliest notebook on the table. Walt watched her leave and then said to Cole quietly, how long has she been here? 3 years. And before that, how long was she invisible? I can tell is about 4 years. After her husband passed, Walt nodded slowly. 7 years. 7 years of this in her. He looked at the notebook on the table. The industry has been trying to replicate this work for a decade, and the woman who did it has been mopping floors. Nothing. The original company, Walt said, clicking his pen. Cole told him the name he'd gotten from Danny's research. Walt wrote it down. They were acquired 2 years ago by a larger automotive group, which means the liability is now carried by... He stopped writing and looked up. Cole, do you understand what I'm telling you? Tell me plainly. The company that took her work no longer exists as an independent entity. It was absorbed, which means the intellectual property claims she may have. Walt looked at the door where Evelyn had walked out are now against a publicly traded automotive group with significantly deeper pockets than the original company, and significantly more motivation to settle quietly rather than litigate a founding theft. He paused. If this goes the way the documentation suggests it might go, Evelyn Carter is not a woman who needs Adrian Cross's offer. She's a woman who is owed a settlement that would make Cross's offer look like a tip. He sat back in his chair. Outside Bay 4, he could hear voices. Evelyn's, clear and steady. The mechanic from Helena. 2 voices he didn't recognize. The specific sounds of someone explaining a problem to someone who already understood it before they finished explaining. He thought about 3 years of that voice in his garage. 3 years of that steadiness. Of arriving before everyone and leaving after, the timing light in the drawer, of Tommy Briggs's intake, and the way she'd pressed her fingers along the runner. He thought about David Carter, whom he'd never met, who'd told his wife that the only thing worse than losing something was deciding it was permanently lost. He said, yeah, make sure she gets what's hers. Walt looked at him with the eyes of a man who had practiced law for 28 years and could tell the difference between a client request and a human one. That's why I drove here, he said. Adrian Cross's week ran out faster than he expected. Not because Evelyn called him, she didn't. Because on day 5, his own legal team flagged something they'd been doing routine due diligence on and found that the IP chain for the diagnostic platform he was building around Evelyn's methodology led back through a recent acquisition to a parent company that was in preliminary communication with an IP attorney in Montana. His general counsel called him at 7 in the morning. The communication is in early stages, she said. But Adrian, if this woman has standing, if her documentation holds up, we're not looking at a licensing negotiation. Looking at prior art claims that could unwind the entire platform. Adrian Cross sat with his phone for a long moment. He thought about Evelyn in Bay 4, the composition notebook, the hand-drawn maps, the 17 notebooks she'd been carrying for 12 years because her father was a machinist who told her to document everything. He thought about what Sattler had said, once in a generation. He thought about the V12 engine erupting back to life. And he thought about the specific, terrible clarity of a man who has tried to acquire something and realized, too late, was that what he was trying to acquire was already more powerful than anything he could contain. Sattler, Gerald, he said, I need honest counsel. That'll cost you more than consulting, Sattler said. Happened. She has documentation. Prior art documentation. She's been carrying it for 12 years in composition notebooks. Sattler was quiet for a long moment. Dated, initialed, and dated. Another silence. Adrian, Sattler said, I'm going to tell you something as your consultant, and I want you to understand that what I'm telling you is in your genuine best interest. A pause. Walk away from the acquisition. The platform. The platform is built on a foundation that belongs to her. If she pursues this, and if she has what you're describing, she will. The platform isn't yours to build. Sattler paused. But there's another position available to you. One that doesn't require owning what isn't yours. Position. Funding, Sattler said simply. Not acquisition. You approach her not as a buyer, but as an investor. Capital behind her. Building. The real version, the thing the current market doesn't have. And you take a minority position. Board observer status. First right of commercial licensing. Controls the IP. She gets the attribution. You get a stake in something that is, by my estimate, significantly more valuable than what you were planning to build. A pause, and you don't spend the next 3 years in litigation over stolen intellectual property. Adrian Cross was quiet. Outside his window, Redwood Falls went about its morning. Down the hill, past the commercial strip he'd spent 4 years reshaping, the Hells Angels garage was already open. Already had cars in the lot. He thought about a woman who could find a ghost fault by listening to an engine, who had walked forward in a room full of laughter and said, give me 5 minutes, who had given him a week and spent it not waiting for him but building. Set up a meeting, Adrian said, not through lawyers. Stage, just he stopped. Ask her if she'll talk to me. I'll ask, Sattler said. I can't promise she'll say yes. I know. Adrian paused. Tell her I'm asking as a person, not as a position. He hung up. And he was. He sat with the window in the morning and the specific unfamiliar weight of a man who has spent years operating from the position of greatest leverage and has just discovered that leverage is not the same thing as strength. Somewhere in Redwood Falls, Evelyn Carter was in Bay 4 with her pencil and her notebooks and the work she'd never stopped doing, the real version, the one the market had been trying and failing to replicate for a decade. And she had not waited for him. She had never been waiting for anyone. She had been building this whole time. Sattler called on a Tuesday morning. Evelyn was in Bay 4 with her third coffee and the 7th notebook open when her flip phone buzzed against the folding table. She looked at the number, didn't recognize it, answered anyway, because she'd stopped hiding from phone calls. The same week, she'd stopped pretending she was only a janitor. Sattler's voice. Careful as always, Adrian wants to meet. Through representatives, not staged. He asked me to tell you he's asking as a person, not a position. A pause. I told him I'd relay the message and that I couldn't promise anything. Evelyn looked at the notebook in front of her. Page 47. The section where the methodology stopped being theoretical and became functional, where 12 years ago, she'd written the sequence that made the whole system coherent, that turned a good idea into something that actually worked. She'd underlined it twice. The ink from the second underlining had gone through to the page below. She said, wherever you're comfortable. Here, she said, for Thursday at 10. I'll tell him. Gerald, she stopped him before he could hang up. You coming with him? A pause. Do you want me to? She thought about it. Yes, she said, but not as his consultant. Another pause. Longer. I understand, Sattler said. And she believed that he did. She told Cole that night. He was locking up the front bay when she found him, and she told him the way she told him most things that directly without preamble, trusting him to receive it without needing it softened. He listened, didn't interrupt. Do you want someone in the room, he said. Walt, she said. If he can be here, Walt can be here. Cole clicked the padlock closed and turned to face her. What are you going to do? She'd been thinking about that since Sadler called. She'd been thinking about it in the specific patient way she thought about engine problems, not forcing a conclusion, but following the logic and seeing where it actually led, rather than where she wanted it to go. Exists, she said. The real version. It's in those notebooks and it's in here. She touched her temple, and it's in the 17 years of knowing exactly why every other version doesn't go far enough. She paused, to build it. I've decided that. The night I wrote What If on a blank page and didn't stop writing until the bay lights started flickering at 2 a. She looked at Cole. The question is what shape the building takes and who's in the room when it happens. And Cross wants to be in that room, wants to own that room, she said. The question is whether he's figured out yet that that's not available. Cole looked at her for a long moment. 3 years of knowing her, 3 years of her being invisible by design. And this was still the version of her he was learning. The version that had been there the whole time, that he'd seen in pieces and glimpses, and in the way she kept a timing light in the exact right drawer. This version rang about building something, talking about what shape things take, with the specific authority of someone who has decided to stop making themselves small. Bring it out Thursday, Cole said. Yes, Evelyn said. He will. Thursday arrived. The way significant days often do, ordinary on the surface. The morning, behaving like every other morning, coffee tasting like coffee, Bay 4 smelling like motor oil, and the particular metalness of clean tools. Go showed up an hour early with explanation and started organizing things that were already organized, which was his version of being present for something he couldn't quite articulate. Ray checked the oil on 2 of the bikes out front, checked one of them twice. Came inside and found reasons to be in the vicinity of Bay 4 without being in Bay 4. Danny stood at the front and said nothing to anyone, which was either his normal state or his version of standing guard, and with Danny the distinction was academic. Walt Greer arrived at 9:30 in his ranch pickup with his briefcase and 2 fresh legal pads and the settled bearing of a man who had walked into important rooms for 28 years and never needed to announce himself. He sat at the folding table beside Evelyn, opened his briefcase, placed the legal pads in front of him, and said, "How are you feeling?" Evelyn said. "Good," Walt said. "Clear is what we want." Adrian Cross arrived at 10 on the dot, which told her something. A man who arrives exactly on time to a meeting like this one is a man who has spent the drive over managing himself. Sadler was with him. Both of them came into Bay 4 without the staging, without the engineers, without the architecture of authority that Adrian had constructed the first time he'd walked into this garage. Just 2 men in plain clothes carrying the weight of what they knew. Adrian looked around Bay 4, at the notebooks stacked on the end of the table, at the diagnostic maps that covered the full surface of the second folding table that Cole had brought in, at the lift, the toolbox, the organized workspace that had gone from janitor's corner to something that looked increasingly like a serious operation, because that was what it was. He sat down without being asked. Sadler sat beside him, sat beside Evelyn. 4 people at a table, no performance. "I know about the documentation," Adrian said. "First thing, didn't build to it, said it clean, which she respected, which she suspected he knew she'd respect. My legal team found the preliminary communication Walt filed. I know what the prior art claim looks like." He paused. "I know I came here with less leverage than I thought I had." "Less leverage," Walt said pleasantly, "is a generous way to frame it." Adrian looked at Walt. "You're being kind. I'm being accurate," Walt said. "The documentation is strong. The claim is strong. The company that acquired the original is considerably motivated to avoid the public narrative of a founding theft. They will settle." He paused. "The question of how much they settle for is a question for litigation, and we're prepared to litigate." Adrian absorbed this. "Then why are you talking to me?" Walt looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Adrian Cross. "Because settling with them gives me justice," she said. "It doesn't give me the work." She held his eyes. "I'm not interested in being compensated for the past. I'm interested in building what I built before, correctly. Correct. This time, in a way that I control." She paused. "You can fund that, or you can watch it happen without you." Those are the options currently available. Adrian was quiet. Sadler had not moved. He was watching Evelyn with the expression of a man who had spent a career estimating the value of things and was doing the calculation in real time and finding that the number kept going up. What does funding look like from your side? Adrian said, opened a legal pad, minority equity position, no controlling interest, no board seat observer rights only, right of commercial licensing for any platform, built on the methodology, subject to terms that Evelyn approves. Full and irrevocable attribution of the methodology to Evelyn Carter in all commercial applications. Revenue share structured on a tiered basis that favors the creator, not the capital. He looked up, and the funding covers facility equipment and a 3-year salary for Evelyn and up to 4 staff she selects. Adrian looked at the numbers Walt had written on the legal pad for a moment. That's not an acquisition, he said. Walt said, it isn't. That's a bet on a person. Yes, Walt said, it is. Adrian Cross looked at Evelyn Carter. He looked at her the way he hadn't allowed himself to look at her on any of the previous occasions, not calculating, not assessing, not running the acquisition arithmetic, just looking at the person. He thought about the V12 erupting back to life. He thought about Peterson sitting down on the stool. He thought about Sadler saying once in a generation. He thought about driving away from this garage a week and a half ago and sitting in his SUV for a long time before he could start the engine. Yes, he said. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. The condition, she said. One that isn't in Walt's term sheet. Adrian waited. The facility, she said, it stays in Redwood Falls. Not a corporate campus, not a tech park here. She paused. And it operates as a training program. Young mechanics, people who want to understand machines the way machines deserve to be understood. Commercial platform funds the program. That's non-negotiable. Adrian looked at her. Something moved in his face, not quite emotion, something adjacent to it. The thing that happens in a person who has spent a long time operating without that particular register and suddenly finds it activated. Non-negotiable, he said. Non-negotiable, she confirmed. He nodded. Okay, Walt wrote it down. The settlement with the automotive group came 4 months later. Walt had been right about their motivation to settle quietly. The negotiation lasted 6 weeks and ended in a number that Walt described to Cole as substantial, and that Cole understood to mean significant enough that Evelyn would never again have to choose between what she needed and what was possible. Included a public acknowledgement of her foundational contribution to the diagnostic methodology, not buried in legal documentation, but stated in a press release that the company's communications team clearly found painful to write, released on a Friday afternoon in the hope that fewer people would read it. More people read it than they'd hoped. The engineering community, which had known for years that something was off about the lineage of the diagnostic platform, had the specific collective reaction of a field that had suspected something and found out it was right. The paper Carver had found in Peterson's office was shared widely. People who had read it years ago and wondered what had happened to the author found out. Evelyn's phone, the flip phone, still, she hadn't upgraded, rang constantly for 2 weeks. She answered it with the same steadiness she brought to everything. Told people what was true when she could, and to comment when she couldn't, and kept going into before every morning because the work didn't stop needing to be done because other things were happening. Called. She was surprised by that. He called her directly, gotten the number through channels she didn't ask about, and said simply that he was glad she was getting what was owed and that he was sorry his equipment had been built on a foundation that wasn't properly credited. Your equipment isn't bad, she told him. It's a good implementation of an incomplete model. When the real version is in the market, you'll see what I mean. I know, Peterson said. I've been reading your paper again, the published version. I think I understand now what it was pointing at that I couldn't see before. A pause. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. The fault in that truck, the electrical ground. If you'd had the full methodology, the real version running as software, would it have found it? She didn't hesitate. In under 4 minutes, automatically, without a human having to know to look from the right angle. Not for a moment. That's what I thought, he said. I look forward to seeing it. Bay 4 became insufficient by the 3rd month. It happened organically, the way things grow when they're built on something real, not through announcement or grand gesture, but through accumulation. The mechanic from Helena became a regular, and then brought his apprentice, and then asked, whether there was a formal way to be involved in what Evelyn was building. Two young women from the community college in Billings came to see what was happening after a professor mentioned the Redwood Falls operation in a class. They came once and didn't leave. One of them started working mornings. The other came on weekends. Both of them sat in on every session where Evelyn walked someone through a diagnostic sequence and explained not just what she was looking for, but why the human mind, trained correctly, could see things that current technology was structurally incapable of catching. Marco enrolled. He did it by putting a note on the folding table that said, "I want to learn this," and signing his name. Evelyn read it, folded it, put it in her jacket pocket with her composition notebook. And the next morning when Marco came in, she handed him a fresh notebook and a set of feeler gauges and said, "Start at the beginning." He started at the beginning. He was good. Not as good as she was. Nobody in that building was. And everyone knew it, and nobody felt diminished by it, because what she was giving them was not a competition, but a language. And learning a language doesn't require being its author. Quality she's looked for above credentials or test scores or prior knowledge. He asked questions from curiosity rather than performance. He wanted to understand, not to be seen understanding. He became her second instructor without anyone formally asking him. He knew things she didn't, the accumulated tactile knowledge of 30 years of hands-on work, the specific intuitions that don't come from design, but from repair, from seeing what breaks and when and why. In front of the training group one morning and told them to ask him about failure patterns in American V8 engines from 1985 to 2002. And Ray talked for 2 hours without stopping, and the room got very quiet in the way. Rooms get quiet when people are genuinely learning. After that, Ray ran Thursday mornings and Evelyn covered the rest of the week, and Cole built a wall between bays 3 and 4 and took it down again and built a better one, and eventually they converted the entire back section of the garage into what the Redwood Falls Gazette described in a piece that ran on the front page and was picked up by 3 regional outlets as a working engineering laboratory and apprenticeship program operating out of a motorcycle club in central Montana. The Gazette reporter had come expecting a human interest story about a biker club with a quirky mechanic and had left with something she spent a week trying to figure out how to categorize. She called Evelyn twice before publishing to verify things she was certain she had wrong. She had not gotten them wrong. The twist came in the 5th month, and nobody saw it coming. Not Walt, not Cole, not Sadler Soap, not Adrian Cross, who by then had attended 3 board observer meetings and distinguished himself by asking good questions and saying less than Evelyn had expected. It came in the form of a letter. Not an email, not a legal communication, not a call through a representative. A letter, handwritten, stationery, from a city in Ohio, addressed to Evelyn Carter, care of the Hellsangels Garage, Redwood Falls, Montana. She opened it at the folding table in Bay 4 with her morning coffee. Writing was careful and slightly shaky, the handwriting of someone older or someone whose hands had given them trouble. It took her 3 sentences to understand who it was from, and when she understood, she set down her coffee and sat very still for a moment. The man who had taken her work, not the company, not the legal entity, the man, his name was Robert Calloway. He had been the director of her division at the Institute, and he had been the person who had restructured around her work and walked away with it in 2014. And he had built a career on the foundation of what she designed. And 2 years ago, the company had been acquired by the automotive group that was now paying her settlement. He had retired to Ohio. She had not heard his name spoken aloud in 11 years. He had thought about him. Of course she had. You don't have something taken from you without thinking about the person who took it. The thinking had changed over years. In the beginning, it had been sharp and consuming, the specific torture of injustice that still feels fresh. Then it had become duller, heavier. Then David had gotten sick, and the thinking had redirected entirely. Then Redwood Falls, and the weight of it had become something she carried without attending to, the way you carry an old injury that's healed enough to function around. She read the letter. Calloway was 71 years old. He had read the press release. He had read the settlement announcement. He had read the Gazette article, that someone had mailed to him because he still had connections in the industry who thought aught he should know. He wrote, spent several weeks deciding whether to contact her and why, and what he could possibly say that would be true and worth saying. He wrote, I knew when I did it that it was wrong. I told myself the reasons that people tell themselves that the work was collaborative, that my position entitled me to certain decisions, that the outcome would serve the field better with institutional backing than with individual credit. I believed some of that at the time, believed less of it over the years. Now I believe none of it. He wrote, I did not know about your husband. When I heard that you had left the institute and disappeared from the field, I assumed it was grief over the work. It was. I did not know there was a different grief occurring at the same time. Sorry for both, he wrote. I am not writing to ask for absolution. I understand that isn't mine to ask for and isn't yours to give on my schedule. I am writing because I read what you are building, and I thought you should know that the person who tried to stop you from having it, who succeeded for a time, is reading about it from Ohio and finding that justice is slower than cruelty, but more durable. He wrote, I hope what you are building becomes everything it was always supposed to be. I believe it will. I always did. That, I think, is the most honest thing I can tell you. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she folded it and held it in both hands and sat in Bay 4 for a long time. She thought about Robert Calloway at 71 in Ohio with his careful, shaky handwriting. She thought about what it cost a person to write a letter like that, not what it absolved, which was nothing, but what it cost. The looking directly at a thing you'd spent 11 years, probably not looking at directly. She thought about David, who had been a man who believed that understanding why people did the things they did was not the same as excusing what they did, but that the understanding mattered anyway. He would have read the letter slowly and carefully, and then said something that clarified it without diminishing it. She put the letter in her jacket pocket. She picked up her pencil. She went back to work. Cole found her at 6 that evening, long after the training session had ended, and the last person had left, and the garage had settled into its evening quiet. She was still at the table, not frantic productive, the specific focused energy of someone who has been inside something real and hasn't wanted to leave because the inside of it is exactly where they're supposed to be. A coffee on the table, black, 2 sugars. She picked it up without looking. He sat on the stool across from her. Long day, he said. Good day, she said. He looked at the maps on the table. They were different from the early ones, more refined, more complete. The architecture of something that had moved past conception into actual construction. Methodology that existed only in notebooks and in Evelyn's hands and mind for 11 years was becoming something that could be documented, taught, implemented, something that other hands could learn to use and build on and carry forward. He said it the way he said everything important, quietly, without preamble. I need to ask you something. Something I should have asked a long time ago. Up. How are you, he said. Not the work, the settlement, not the program, you. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter in her jacket pocket, about the charity ride, and the parking lot people, and Saller's careful voice on the phone, and Walt's legal pad, and Marco writing, I want to learn this, and signing his name. She thought about 3 years of arriving before everyone and leaving after, and being present in a space where nobody looked at her hands. She thought about David saying the only thing worse than losing something is deciding it's permanently lost. I'm better than I've been in a long time, she said. And it was true in the specific way that things are true when they've been tested against the real and held up. Cole nodded. He looked at the notebook stacked at the end of the table. The earliest one on top, worn at the spine, the cover soft from 12 years of jacket pockets. Army Briggs, he said. The guy who built the intake on the truck. He would have Cole stopped, started again. He was the kind of person who built things that outlasted him, who made things that kept working after he was gone. He paused. I think he would have liked, knowing you were the one who knew how to hear what he'd built. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Tell me about him, she said. And Cole did. He talked about Tommy for 20 minutes, the kind of talking you do when you've been holding something in memory that deserves to be said out loud, that deserves a listener who will receive it with the weight it carries. He talked about Tommy's hands, which were the hands of someone who built things the way they should be built, and his laugh was enormous and came from somewhere genuine, and the night he'd fabricated the intake and called Cole at 2 a. to describe what he'd done because he was too proud to wait until morning. Evelyn listened the way she listened to engines, not waiting for it to stop, but hearing what it was saying. Cole finished. They sat in the quiet of the garage together, the V12 at rest in its bay, the toolbox against the wall, timing light in its drawer. Cole, she said. Yeah, I walked forward that Friday, in front of everyone. She paused. I wasn't sure it would work. He looked at her. You said you were sure. I know what I said. She held his eyes. I was sure about the diagnosis. I was sure about what was wrong and how to fix it. She paused. I wasn't sure the engine would respond. There's always a moment after you've done everything right where the machine has to decide. She looked at the truck. It decided. Cole was quiet for a moment. We're glad it did, he said. So am I, she said. 6 months after Evelyn Carter had walked forward in a room full of laughter and said, give me 5 minutes. The Carter methodology, her name on it, her attribution in every document, in every platform, in every training manual was in formal beta testing with 4 automotive companies and 2 independent diagnostic software developers. The training program had enrolled apprentices from 5 states. He was teaching his first session independently on Friday mornings. The mechanic from Helena had become a formal instructor. 2 of the community college women from Billings were running the documentation process, turning Evelyn's notebooks and maps into materials that could be taught, carried, used. Came for a 3-day working session in the 4th month and left with an understanding of what the full methodology could do that he spent his drive home trying to articulate and couldn't, because some things are larger than the vocabulary you arrive with. Sadler attended the first formal demonstration of the beta platform and sat in the back of the room very quietly and at the end said to Evelyn, without performance, without consulting authority, just as one person to another, this is what it was supposed to be. Yes, she said, it is. Adrian Cross attended too. He sat in the observer section and asked 2 questions, and both of them were good ones, which she noted. After the session, he found her and said, I understand now why you wouldn't take the offer. She said, all of it, he said. But specifically what I was offering you was a ceiling. What you were building was, he stopped. There's no ceiling on this, is there? She said, there isn't. He nodded slowly. He looked like a man in the ongoing process of learning something that didn't come naturally, which was the most accurate description of where Adrian Cross was in his life at that moment, and which was, Evelyn thought, a place for him to be, the last person to find out about all of it, or the last person who mattered in the specific way that some people matter more than you can articulate, was a woman named Carol Briggs, who was Tommy's sister, who had stayed in Redwood Falls after her brother passed, and who had never been inside the Hell's Angels garage in her life. Brought her. He'd grown up 2 streets from the Briggs house and had known Carol his whole life, and had called her after the night Cole talked about Tommy and told her she should come see something. She came on a Saturday morning when the garage was full apprentices working, Ray running his sesh, the beta platform running diagnostics on 3 different vehicles simultaneously. She stood in Bay 4 and looked at the diagnostic maps and at the notebooks and at the platform display showing its relational failure analysis in real time, and she looked at it the way people look at things that contain a piece of something they've lost. Evelyn came and stood beside her. My brother would have. Carol stopped. He would have spent 3 days in here and never wanted to leave. I know, Evelyn said. I never met him. But I know. Carol looked at her. Cole said you heard what he built. In the intake, I did. Then you knew him, Carol said simply. In the way that matters. Evelyn put her hand briefly on Carol's arm. Just briefly. Just enough. Then she went back to work because the work was there. And it was hers and it was real and it was only beginning. What Evelyn Carter understood, had all understood at the deepest level, the level where the truest knowledge lives, was that machines don't lie. They fail and they resist and they present symptoms that misdirect and confuse. But underneath all of that, they are always telling you exactly what is wrong if you know how to listen. If you have the patience and the skill and the willingness to sit with the problem until the problem reveals itself rather than forcing the answer you brought with you. We're like that too. You could scan them with the best equipment available and get clean readings. You could apply professional certainty, and institutional authority, and the full weight of expertise and money, and come away with a report that said nothing is wrong. Here, everything is within normal parameters. We find no significant fault, and still be completely wrong about what was standing in front of you. The woman they had looked through for 3 years had been building something the whole time. In notebooks, in composition after composition after composition, in the specific patient, enduring way that genuine knowledge is built, not announced, not displayed, not dependent on anyone's recognition to remain true. She had walked forward in a room full of laughter. She had put her hands on the machine. She had listened. And the machine had answered. That was the whole story. And it was also the beginning of every story that came after every apprentice who learned to hear what the computers couldn't. Every diagnosis that caught what the threshold scanners missed. Every piece of knowledge passed from Evelyn's hands into hands that would carry it further than she would. The woman nobody noticed had become the person nobody could afford to overlook. Not because she had changed, because the world had finally gotten quiet enough to hear what she'd always been saying.